I'm only going to say this once more, old-timer. Stay out of it. Officer Derek Holt's voice was sharp, a final warning before his open palm swung back in a wide theatrical arc and cracked across the elderly man's face, hard enough to echo off the mall's ceiling. The mall went dead silent. Walter Greaves's head snapped sideways with the impact. He didn't stumble. He didn't reach for his cheek. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, while Holt rolled his shoulder back with the lazy satisfaction of a man who believed the world always bent to his will. Yet Officer Derek Holt didn't know was that he had just laid hands on the one man alive who knew exactly how to end a fight without throwing a single punch first. The mall was loud, the way malls always get in December. Holiday music bounced off the tile floors. Kids tugged at their mothers' sleeves. The smell of cinnamon from a candle shop drifted into fried food smells from the food court. Walter Greaves moved through it all, slowly, unhurried, the way a man moves when he has nowhere urgent to be, and has spent a long life learning to be grateful for that. He was 68, silver-haired, dark-pressed slacks, a gray cardigan buttoned nearly to the collar. His late wife used to tell him he dressed like he was always expecting company. He never stopped. He paused at the jewelry counter inside the shopping center and looked down through the glass. 2 necklaces, both silver. One held a small star pendant, the other a thin chain with a delicate letter charm, W for Willow, his granddaughter, turning 12 in 3 weeks and already sharper than half the adults in her life, which made him prouder than he ever said aloud. The letter his friend Desmond offered, appearing at his elbow. Walter didn't look up. I didn't ask. You've been staring at that case for 4 minutes. You need an opinion. The star. Walter said, she's 12, not 9. Stars don't have an age. The letter says her name matters. The star says, Desmond. What? Be quiet a minute. Desmond Hale was 71, retired after 30 years with the Postal Service, and carried strong opinions about everything. He was Walter's oldest friend, which meant Walter had spent decades patiently ignoring opinions with real affection underneath it. The young sales associate, her name tag read Tasha, leaned across the counter with a warm smile. Would you like to see either one out of the case, sir? The star, please, Walter said. She set it gently on the velvet tray. Walter lifted it carefully, turning it in his fingers. Small, simple, the kind of piece a girl could grow into instead of out of. His late wife would have known instantly which one was right. She always did. Walter had been making these calls alone for 4 years now, and he still second-guessed every one of them. He set it back down. I'll take this one. Tasha reached for the box. Behind him, the mall kept moving. Walter watched its reflection in the glass without appearing to watch anything at all. A security guard crossing the far end of the atrium. The family arguing about lunch. 2 teenagers cutting through the crowd too fast, the way teenagers always do. Like stillness was something that only happened to other people. His eyes drifted across all of it, the way water moves across a floor, quiet, complete, catching every edge. He'd done this so long, he no longer noticed he was doing it. You want it gift-wrapped? Tasha asked. Please. Desmond leaned on the counter. You should grab the letter charm, too. Backup gift in case she hates the star. She won't hate the star. You don't know that. I know my granddaughter. You see her four times a year. Walter looked at him. Desmond, I'm only saying kids are unpredictable. My granddaughter went through a phase where she'd only wear orange. Nobody saw that coming. Tasha wrapped the box, fighting back a smile and losing. Walter turned back toward the counter and caught his own reflection in the dark glass for a moment. An old man in a good cardigan, buying a Christmas gift. This was his life now, carefully built. The garden out back. Sunday phone calls. Willow's voice on the other end, telling him about her week with the particular urgency of someone who needed to be heard and knew she was. It was a quiet life. It was the life he had chosen, once there was finally a choice to make. Tasha slid the wrapped box across the counter. She's going to love it. Walter picked it up. Thank you. He and Desmond moved away, heading toward the food court. Desmond was already debating where to eat. Walter listened with half his attention. With the other half, he did what he had always done. what had kept him alive in places he never talked about. He watched. The sound reached him before the words did. A voice raised, deliberate, carrying the particular edge of someone who wanted to be heard, not because they were afraid, but because they were in charge and wanted everyone nearby to know it. Walter slowed his steps, 20 yards ahead, outside a clothing store with a red sale sign in the window. A man in a Caldwell County uniform had a young woman by the upper arm. She looked about 24, black, still in pale blue nursing scrubs, the kind that meant the end of a long shift. She held a small paper receipt out toward the officer with her free hand, arm fully extended, the way you hold something out a person who keeps refusing to look at it. The officer wasn't looking at it. He was broad, younger than he carried himself, his badge reading Holt. He had the stance of a man who had done this before, feet planted wide, chin slightly raised, voice pitched just loud enough to draw an audience. "Damn, I need you to calm down." "I am calm," the young woman said, her voice steady but thin, stretched tight over something trying hard not to shake. "You have my receipt. I paid for the scarf. It's in the bag." "That's what you're telling me. That's what the receipt says." "Your receipts get faked." She stared at him. "I bought a $12 scarf." Holt's mouth curved slightly, like this was mildly entertaining. A small crowd gathered the way mall crowds always do, close enough to watch, far enough to pretend they weren't. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. A woman pushing a stroller stopped, then deliberately turned and walked the other way. Desmond's hand found Walter's sleeve. "Don't," he said quietly. Walter watched the young woman's face, watched her fight to hold it together. The controlled breathing, the careful voice, the way her eyes were bright and wide because she knew, the way every black woman in this country learns to know, that losing her composure right now would become the story. That her fear would be used as proof of something. That there was no version of this where she was simply right, and he was simply wrong, and it ended there. She was doing everything correctly, and it wasn't working. "Don't," Desmond said again. Walter handed him the gift bag. He walked forward at the same unhurried pace he'd kept all afternoon, no tension in his shoulders. He stopped roughly 6 feet from Holt and the young woman and said clearly, without raising his voice, "Excuse me." Holt turned. He looked Walter up and down the way some men do, a quick assessment, an instant filing away. "Old man, cardigan, no threat. Sir, this isn't your concern. Keep walking." It was Walter Greaves. "I was at the jewelry counter across the atrium when this young woman walked into that store, and when she walked out." He kept his voice level, factual, the voice of a man giving a report. "She didn't act suspiciously. She made a purchase." He watched her do it. Holt stared at him for a beat. "Good for you. Keep moving. There's no cause for detaining her." Something shifted in Holt's expression, the mild amusement hardening into something else. "I'm only going to say this one more time." He stepped toward Walter. "Mind your business." "Behind Walter," Desmond said quietly, urgently. "Walter, come on, let go." The young woman's eyes flicked to Walter. He caught them for a second. In them, something not quite hope, but the exhausted recognition of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to step in and didn't know what to do now that someone had. Walter didn't move. He looked at Holt and didn't look away, didn't shift his weight, didn't blink. He simply stood the particular way certain men stand when they've been in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and walked out the other side every time. "She's free to go," Walter said. The stillness around them deepened. Holt's jaw tightened. He looked at Walter the way men like him look at people who refuse to shrink, like the refusal itself was a personal insult, like dignity in someone he'd already written off was the most aggravating thing in the world. He leaned in. "Old man," he said, "back up." The word landed exactly the way he meant it to, loud enough for the crowd to hear, deliberate, a test and a statement at once. Walter didn't move, not even slightly. Holt's hand came back, open palm, a wide theatrical arc, the kind of swing that wanted witnesses. His eyes stayed on Walter the entire time, mean and bright, completely certain of what came next. The crack of it echoed off the atrium ceiling. Walter's head turned with the impact, a sharp, clean sound. His eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, not from pain, not from shock, but the way a man's eyes move when something lands, and the body registers it before the mind decides what happens next. For one full second, nobody in that mall made a sound. Holt savored that second. You could see it on his face, the silence, the stillness, the old man absorbing it. He rolled his shoulder back with the easy comfort of someone who'd just confirmed something he already believed about the world. His hand came back a second time, same arc, same confidence, same total certainty of what came next. It never landed. Later, people would struggle to describe what they saw. They'd use words like impossible, and I don't even know how to explain it. A woman near the food court would tell her daughter the first slap happened before anyone could react, but the second one never had a chance. The teenage boy would post the footage with shaking hands before he'd even fully processed what he'd filmed. What happened next took 2 seconds, maybe less. Walter hadn't stumbled from the first hit. He hadn't reached for his face. He hadn't made a sound. The instant Holt's hand came back, for the second swing, Walter's left hand shot up and caught Holt's extended wrist mid-arc, clean, like plucking something out of the air. Then, several things happened in a sequence so practiced it looked almost calm. A step inward, inside Holt's guard, close enough that size stopped mattering. A rotation of the wrist outward, precise, applied to exactly the degree the joint allowed, and not 1 degree further. A controlled forward press, using Holt's own weight and momentum against him. And then Derek Holt, 6 feet tall, 210 pounds, 17 years on the force intimidating people in public, was face down on the mall tile, with his cheek pressed against the linoleum and his own pulse pounding in his ears. His sidearm had skidded 8 feet across the floor. Walter stepped back. He reached up and straightened his cardigan. He looked down at Holt on the ground, breathing, hard, unhurt, staring at the floor with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the moment had just collapsed, and said quietly, "Without heat, you should stay there." Then the mall exploded, not violence, just sound. Voices everywhere at once. Someone screamed. Someone laughed, a short, shocked bark of disbelief. People talked over each other. A child somewhere began crying because the adults around him had suddenly stopped acting like adults. A young woman in the nursing scrubs, her name was Renee Holloway, though Walter didn't know that yet, stood frozen with the receipt still in her hand, staring at Walter the way people look at something they have no category for. 15 feet away, a teenager named Tyrell Banks had gone completely still. He was 17, worked the pretzel stand 3 days a week, saving for community college. His phone was already in his hand. He'd started filming the moment the old man in the cardigan first walked up. Something about the whole scene making the hair on his neck stand on end, and he hadn't stopped recording since. He had everything from the start. Holt grabbing Renee, the receipt, the word old man, the first slap landing. The second slap stopped cold. The 2 seconds, all of it. Desmond stood 10 feet behind Walter with the gift bag dangling from his fingers. His face a strange mix of laughter and prayer. A second officer arrived at a jog 90 seconds later, younger than Holt, visibly rattled. He helped Holt off the floor. Holt's face was red, breathing through his nose in short, controlled pulls. He didn't look at Walter. Out of pure reflex, the muscle memory of a man needing to control something, Holt turned to Renee and said, "You're under arrest." His partner put a hand on his arm, said something low, gestured at the 40 people standing in a loose circle around them. Several with phones still raised, and pointed at the receipt, still clutched in Renee's hand. Holt released her 40 seconds after grabbing her. Renee didn't run. She walked away steadily, back straight, and never looked back. Walter returned to the jewelry counter. Tasha, the sales associate, was gripping the edge of the display case with both trembling hands. She processed the transaction in near silence and, when it was done, gave him a 20% discount she invented on the spot, because she couldn't think of anything else to do. "Thank you," Walter said. He and Desmond walked out of the shopping center into the cold December afternoon. Desmond didn't say a single word the entire drive home, the quietest he'd been in 30 years. At 4:47 that afternoon, Tyrell Banks uploaded the video. By midnight, 6 million people had watched a silver-haired man in a gray cardigan absorb a hit, catch the second swing, and put a police officer flat on the floor of a Georgia mall. The title read, "Old Man, Don't Try It." Bill Garner watched the footage 3 times. He didn't watch it the way most people did, leaning forward, mouth open, replaying the 2 seconds again and again. He watched it the way a man studies something he needs to fully understand before deciding what to do about it, sitting still, his office door closed, his desk phone face down, early morning light slicing through the blinds in thin gray bands. He's 6 million views. He closed the laptop, picked up his phone, and made 3 calls. The first to the mall's director of security. The second to District Attorney Russell Cobb. The third to his nephew. Each call short. Each call calm. Each call ending the same way, with the other person understanding precisely what was needed without Garner ever saying it outright. That was the nature of a machine that had run smoothly for 20 years. You no longer had to explain it. You just turned the key. By 9 that morning, Derek Holt sat across from Garner with a legal pad and a pen, writing his incident report. "Take your time," Garner told him. "Be thorough." Holt wrote for 40 minutes. When he finished, the report described an elderly civilian who had inserted himself into an active law enforcement situation, ignored repeated lawful orders to step back, and then executed what appeared to be a trained combat maneuver that left the officer fearing for his life. There was no mention of a slap, no mention of a receipt, no mention of a young woman in nursing scrubs who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Garner read it once, nodded, and signed the bottom. By 11, the Caldwell County Police Department issued its official statement. Careful language, the kind that sounds measured and reasonable to anyone who hadn't seen the footage, and offers just enough cover to anyone who had. An ongoing investigation into an assault on a law enforcement officer. The department takes such incidents seriously. The public is asked to withhold judgment until all facts are known. Holt's photo ran beside it, a professional headshot, a flag in the background, 17 years of service. By 1, DA Russell Cobb had signaled to the Caldwell Tribune that he was reviewing the case for charges. The Tribune's front page the next morning would carry a headline about an officer assaulted by an unidentified aggressor, a phrase that would have been almost laughable if the stakes weren't what they were. The video kept spreading. Garner knew he couldn't touch that part. It was everywhere, national news, social media, morning radio. People were calling Walter a hero. People were calling for Holt's badge. The noise was loud, and coming from every direction at once. Noise wasn't law. Noise wasn't a courtroom. Noise was just noise, and Garner had outlasted noise plenty of times before. He could control was the local machinery, the framing, the charges, the timeline. He'd run this city a long time, and he hadn't done it by panicking when things got loud. He made one more call, this time to the clothing store's regional legal team. The conversation was brief. By the following morning, the store issued a statement saying no formal shoplifting accusation had ever been filed and that they regretted any misunderstanding. Derek Holt's name appeared nowhere in it. At 2:14 that afternoon, 2 officers in a marked cruiser pulled up outside a small house on Maple Hollow Lane, with a garden out front that had been carefully maintained straight through winter. Walter answered the door in the same cardigan. He looked at the 2 officers on his porch, then past them at the cruiser, idling at the curb. He said nothing. He simply waited with the patience of a man who had survived harder things than this, understanding that sometimes you wait to hear what's coming before deciding how to meet it. He told him he was under arrest for felony assault on a law enforcement officer. He asked if he could grab his coat. He said yes. He got his coat, locked his front door, and walked to the cruiser unassisted, climbing into the back seat on his own. The neighbors watching from their windows would later say he looked exactly the same as always, like nothing about this surprised him, like he'd already decided, somewhere quiet inside himself, exactly how he was going to carry it. Desmond saw the cruiser from across the street and rushed inside for his phone. He called Renata at 2:31. She picked up on the second ring. Renata drove the 2 hours from the city in under 90 minutes. She barely remembered the drive itself. She remembered the phone call. She remembered Desmond's voice, steady, but carrying something underneath it that Desmond, a man who had an opinion about everything and was never short on words, almost never showed. Something that sounded like fear dressed up as calm. They put your father in handcuffs, Renata, in front of the whole street. She remembered, pulling out of the parking garage. She didn't remember much after that until the county jail's processing entrance appeared in front of her, and she was pushing through the glass doors with her briefcase, her bar credentials and years of wrongful arrest litigation experience, fueled by the particular fury of a daughter raised to believe the law was a system worth trusting. She posted bail using her firm's emergency fund and waited. Walter came through the processing door at 8:47 that evening, his folded cardigan over one arm, collar still straight. He looked at Renata the way he always did, steady, quiet, taking her in like something he was grateful for. He had to press her back teeth together to keep her face from doing something she didn't want it to do in a county jail lobby. She hugged him. He held on a moment longer than usual. Then he said, "You didn't need to drive tonight." "Yeah, I'm serious. It could have waited until..." It could not have waited. He looked like he might argue. He didn't. The bail conditions were read to Renata by a clerk who had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable delivering them. No contact with any mall employees. A 1-mile exclusion zone around the shopping center. Passport surrendered, effective immediately. She filed for a rapid hearing before they left the building and was given a date 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. She didn't say what she was thinking. She thanked the clerk and walked her father to the car. He sat at his kitchen table until almost midnight. Renata had her legal pad, her pen, the charge sheet she'd already read 4 times, each read worse than the last. She asked Walter questions. He answered carefully and completely, the way he did everything, without rushing, without editorializing, giving her only what was true and exactly what she needed. She had the entire incident documented in 40 minutes. She set her pen down. Then she asked the other question, the one she'd never asked before, not properly, not with the full weight of it behind the words. She asked him to tell her everything, not just about the mall, about all of it, about what he had actually done for 30 years before he retired, to this house, this garden, and Sunday phone calls with his granddaughter. Walter looked at his hands on the table for a long moment. Then he told her. He spoke quietly, without drama, the way you describe things that happened long enough ago, that the sharpest edges have worn smooth, even if the shape never changed. He talked for a long time. Renata didn't interrupt. She didn't write anything down. She just listened, and the woman who had sat through depositions, courtrooms, and hostile boardrooms for 15 years, sat very still at her father's kitchen table and listened to who her father actually was. When he finished, the kitchen went quiet. Renata looked at him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Walter was quiet a moment. He looked out the window at the dark garden beyond it. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me for the garden," he said. He looked at him a long time. There were things she wanted to say. She couldn't find the shape of any of them. So she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his palm up and held on. He went to bed an hour later. She heard him moving in his room, heard a closet open, heard a box lifted down from a shelf, heard him set it down somewhere solid, heard it open. A long silence, then it closed, then nothing. Renata sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened her legal pad to a fresh page. At the top, in clean, precise handwriting, she wrote 3 words. "Walter Greaves, defendant, my father." She underlined it twice. Then she picked up her pen and began. The next 3 days moved in 2 directions at once. Renata built. Garner buried. They worked in parallel. One at a kitchen table with a legal pad and a laptop. The other behind a closed office door with a phone and 20 years of favors to call in. Neither could see the other clearly yet, but both knew the other was there. Renata was up before 6 every morning. She mapped the case across 3 color-coded legal pads with sticky tabs. She pulled precedent. She contacted witnesses. She called Renee Holloway, who answered on the first ring and said yes, yes, she would testify, yes, she would put everything in writing, yes, she understood what that might cost, and she was doing it anyway. Renata wrote Renee's name at the top of a fresh page and underlined it. She called Desmond, who said, "Tell me what you need, and I'll be there." She was building something real. Garner was building something too. On the second morning, the police union went on local radio. The spokesperson, a thick-voiced man who'd been doing this 11 years, described the mall incident as an unprovoked trained attack on a uniformed officer performing his lawful duties. He used the word trained 3 times. He talked about officer safety. He talked about the dangers of the job. He never once mentioned Renee Holloway. That same afternoon, the clothing store released its own statement. 2 careful paragraphs expressed regret for any misunderstanding and confirming no formal accusation had ever been filed. The store valued all its customers. Holt's name appeared nowhere in it. Their legal team had called Garner's assistant the morning before. Renata read the statement at the kitchen table and circled the phrase, "no formal accusation," twice. Hard enough that the pen nearly tore through the page. In came Terrell Banks. He was 17, he'd filmed the whole thing, and the video had been seen by 12 million people by the time the mall called him in. The manager, a soft-faced man in a department store tie who couldn't quite meet Tyrell's eyes, explained that using his personal phone during work hours violated mall policy, effective immediately. Tyrell asked if this was about the video. The manager said it was a policy matter. Tyrell asked when they'd ever enforced that policy before. The manager said he was free to collect his things from his locker. Tyrell was the only income in his household 3 days a week. He had $412 saved toward community college. He walked out of the mall still in his pretzel stand uniform and sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time before starting the engine. Renata didn't know about Tyrell yet. She would. On the third morning, DA Russell Cobb made it official. He held a brief press conference outside the county courthouse, a practiced expression of reluctant civic duty on his face, and announced that after reviewing the evidence, his office would pursue the maximum available charge. 4 years. Renata watched it on her laptop at her father's kitchen table. Walter was out in the garden. She didn't call him in to watch. He called her co-counsel instead, a woman named Patrice, with 15 years of civil rights litigation behind her. The sharpest pattern of conduct attorney, Renata knew. "You need everything we have on department misconduct cases," Renata said. "Buried complaints, systemic cover-ups, pattern of conduct defenses, everything." Patrice asked, "How bad is it?" Renata looked at the charge sheet on the table. "They're going after a 68-year-old Medal of Honor recipient for defending himself after a cop slapped him in a shopping mall." She paused. "So yeah, it's bad." Patrice said she'd pull the files that night. Renata hung up and stared at the wall. Outside, she could hear Walter moving between the garden beds, the quiet, unhurried sound of a man doing something with his hands that gave him peace. She'd watched him out there every morning since arriving, tending things, patient, deliberate. He never looked worried. She didn't know if that was strength, or simply a man who'd learned, somewhere she was only beginning to understand, to keep his fear where nobody could see it. She picked up her pen. At the top of a fresh legal pad page, she wrote, "Who has Holt done this to before?" She stared at the question for a long time, then drew a line down the center of the page and began filling in both sides. The text arrived at 6:52 in the morning. Renata was on her second coffee, legal pad open, when her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, 1 line. "I have something you need to see. I can't come to your office. Name a place." She stared at it. In 15 years of law, anonymous contacts went one of 2 ways. Exactly what they claimed to be, or something else entirely, a setup, a distraction, something designed to pull you sideways as when you needed to be moving straight. She typed back, "Riverside Memorial Park, the bench by the East Pond, 7 tonight. No response came. No confirmation. Just silence, the particular kind that arrives when someone has already made their decision and doesn't need to discuss it further. Renata went back to her legal pad, but didn't write anything for a while. She arrived at the park 10 minutes early. The December air was sharp and clean, the pond gray and still, frost edging the banks. A few ducks moved near the far side. The bench faced the water, back to the walking path, meaning she could hear footsteps approaching, without appearing to watch for them. Walter had taught her that, though she hadn't realized until 3 nights ago why she'd always done it. The footsteps came at exactly 7. The woman who sat beside her was black, mid-40s, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, dark jacket, wool hat pulled low. She moved with the contained, deliberate posture of someone who'd spent years being watched and learned to take up exactly as much space as needed, no more. She didn't introduce herself right away. She looked at the pond a moment, then said, "My name is Carla Doyle. I'm a lieutenant with the Caldwell County Police Department." She paused. For now. Renata looked at her. Doyle reached into her jacket and produced a manila folder, holding it out. Renata took it. Inside were pages, clean, organized, dated, summaries, case numbers, incident logs, names, addresses, brief accounts of what happened and when. Renata read the first page, then the second. She slowed on the third. 14 complaints, Doyle said. 4 years. Excessive force, discriminatory targeting. 2 cases involved direct physical contact. A Latino man outside a convenience store in 2021, and a black teenager in a park in 2022. She said it the way you say something you've repeated in your own head so many times it's lost its shape, but kept all its weight. Every complaint was received. Everyone assigned a case number. Everyone closed without action. Renata looked up. Closed by who? These 12 were under Captain Garner's direct authority, Doyle said, voice steady. The other 2 went to a supervisor who understood which way the wind blew. Renata looked back down at the folder, turning another page, another name, another date, another buried case number. How long have you been building this? 3 years. Doyle looked out at the pond. The first time I tried to move it up the chain, I was passed over for a promotion I'd earned by every measurable standard. The second time, my partner was reassigned without explanation. The third time, a senior officer sat across from me in a conference room and told me, calmly, professionally, like career advice, that this wasn't a path I wanted to go down. The ducks moved across the gray water. Neither woman watched them. So why now? Renata asked. Doyle was quiet a moment. Because I spent 3 years telling myself I was being strategic, she said. Waiting for the right moment, the right case, the right set of circumstances. She stopped, started again. They arrested a 68-year-old man in handcuffs and walked him out of his house in front of his neighbors. He watched it happen on the news in my living room, and I thought, she stopped again, jaw tight. I am done being strategic. Renata closed the folder carefully. If I use this, she said, your name will eventually come out. You understand that? I do. Garner will come after you. I know what Garner does. Doyle looked at her directly for the first time. You've watched him do it for 4 years. I'm not afraid of him. She said it plainly, not bravely, just as fact. Renata held the folder against her chest. I'll need a sworn remote affidavit, she said. Secure channel. I can have it set up by tomorrow morning. Doyle nodded, stood, buttoned her jacket, and walked back up the path without looking back. Renata sat alone on the bench a long time after that. The frost thickened at the pond's edge. She opened the folder again in the dark and read every one of the 14 names slowly, one by one. Each one was somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's neighbor. Her jaw tightened with every page. The request was 3 paragraphs long and took Renata 11 minutes to write. She drafted longer briefs in her sleep, but this one needed something different, a particular kind of precision, because she was asking a federal agency to unseal a document about her own father, filing as his attorney, needing every word to carry both weights at once without buckling. She filed it at 7 in the morning. The Department of Defense acknowledgement came back at 7:43. Automated, impersonal, informing her the request had been received and would require 2 separate security clearance verifications before processing. Estimated return, 48 hours. She printed the acknowledgement and added it to the file. Then she waited. The folder arrived electronically 49 hours later, at 9 in the morning. Renata opened it at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, her reading glasses, and the quiet, systematic focus she brought to every document that mattered. She expected 4 pages, maybe 6. The document was 41 pages long. She set her coffee down. Most of it was black, not redacted the way civilian records sometimes are, with a word here, a name there. This was whole pages reduced to single visible lines, entire paragraphs where only a date or location code survived. Deployment records that started and stopped abruptly, not because the missions ended, but because what happened in them was still, decades later, something the government had decided the public didn't need to know. Renata read what was visible, slowly and completely. 31 years of special operations service, that much was clear. 3 confirmed combat theaters. Commendations referencing actions the commendations themselves never described. A record of a man who'd spent the better part of his adult life going to places that didn't officially exist, doing things never officially confirmed, then coming home to a house with a garden and a wife and a daughter who believed her father had worked in military logistics. She turned to the final section, dated 2009, a formal amendment to the service record. She read the heading twice before it settled. A military honor originally issued as a classified Silver Star had been reviewed and upgraded. Effective immediately upon review, Walter James Greaves was the recipient of the Medal of Honor. The citation below was 2 paragraphs. The first almost entirely redacted. The second was not. In defense of civilian non-combatants, under conditions of direct and sustained enemy fire, the soldier demonstrated singular acts of personal valor that resulted in the preservation of multiple civilian lives. His actions on this date, carried out without order and without regard for personal safety, represent the highest standard of selfless service this nation can recognize. Location of action, Mogadishu, Somalia. Date, October 4th, 1993. Renata read it 3 times. October 4th, 1993. She knew that date. Everyone who had ever read about that era knew it. The day the whole operation came apart. The day that city swallowed American soldiers whole. The day news cameras captured enough of it to make the entire country flinch. Her father had been there. Her father had been there, and he had put himself between civilians and people trying to kill them. And then he had come home and said nothing, and planted roses, and argued with Desmond about jewelry, and called his granddaughter every Sunday, like it was the most important thing he did all week, which she understood now, suddenly, it probably was. She sat at the table a long time. The house was quiet around her, the garden dark through the window. She found him outside, crouched near the far bed, working the soil near the base of one of his late wife's roses, unhurried as always. He said, "Dad." He looked up. She said, "You have a Medal of Honor." He looked at her a moment, then stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "It's in a box," he said. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" He was quiet a moment, looked at the rose bed, then back at her. "Those weren't my medals to be proud of," he said. "Those were days I survived." He paused. The men who didn't survive, those were the heroes. Renata stood in the cold garden beside her father and couldn't find a single word large enough for what she was feeling. So she said nothing. She just stood there. After a moment, Walter went back to the roses, and she stayed until the cold pushed her inside. She left the folder open on the kitchen table. She didn't close it that night. Nobody ever told Garner directly that Doyle had talked. Nobody had to. 20 years of running a department teaches you to read the temperature of a room, to notice which conversation stops when you walk in, to feel the particular shift that happens when someone inside your machine has decided they're no longer part of it. Garner had felt that shift before. He knew exactly what it meant and exactly what to do about it. He made 2 calls on a Tuesday morning. The afternoon, the paperwork was already moving. Carla Doyle was at her desk reviewing shift reports when her supervising officer appeared in her doorway. He'd worked alongside her for 9 years. He didn't look at her directly when he spoke. telling her she was being placed on administrative suspension effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. The allegation, a falsified overflapping report submitted 18 months earlier. Doyle set down her pen. She asked him to repeat the specific allegation. He did. His eyes stayed somewhere near her left shoulder. She thought about the overtime report he was describing. She remembered filling it out. She remembered it being accurate, because she was constitutionally incapable of submitting something she knew was wrong, which was precisely what had made the last 4 years, inside this department, so exhausting. "This is fabricated," she said. He said the investigation would determine that. She said, "We both know what this is, Carl." He didn't answer. He told her to surrender her badge and service weapon and remain available for questioning, but not to report to the building until further notice. She placed her badge on the desk between them, placed her weapon beside it, stood, picked up her jacket and her personal items, and walked out of the Caldwell County Police Department without another word to anyone. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 10 minutes, then drove home. She didn't call Renata. Renata's affidavit had already been submitted through the secure channel 2 days prior. Whatever Garner was trying to prevent, he was already too late by exactly 48 hours. The upgraded charges landed the following morning. Renata was at the kitchen table when her phone rang. It was a clerk from the DA's office, reading the amended charge sheet in the careful, neutral voice of someone trained not to show that they were delivering bad news. In addition to the existing felony assault count, Walter Greaves would now face a charge of resisting detainment, arising from his failure to immediately comply when Officer Holt first ordered him to back away. Combined maximum sentence, 4 to 7 years. Renata wrote the number down and stared at it. 7 years. Her father was 68 years old. She thanked the clerk and ended the call. She picked up her pen, set it back down, stood, and went to the window to look at the garden for a full minute, breathing deliberately the way she'd learned to breathe before a difficult cross-examination, when everything depended on keeping her head clear. Then she went back to the table and filed an emergency motion to dismiss before noon. She told Walter over dinner the fabricated allegation against Doyle, the timing, the upgraded charges, the new maximum sentence. Then she finished. The kitchen was quiet. Walter looked at his plate a moment, then at Renata. "Doyle's affidavit," he said. "Is it already submitted 2 days ago?" He nodded slowly. "So he's too late for that, yes. But the upgraded charges are real," Renata said. "The hearing is set. And Dad." She stopped, started again. "Judge Reeves is assigned to the motion." She watched his face for recognition. It registered. Even Walter, who didn't follow local politics closely, knew the name Franklin Reeves. Caldwell wasn't a big city. Walter picked up his fork, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Then he said, "When's the hearing?" She told him. He nodded, stood, carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it with the same unhurried movements he used for everything, then went to the back door and stepped outside into the dark garden. She heard him out there a long time afterward, moving slowly between the beds, quiet and deliberate. She sat at the table with the charge sheet in front of her. 7 years. She picked up her pen and got back to work. The courtroom filled fast. By 8:30 in the morning, every seat in the gallery was taken. More people filled the hallway outside, pressing close to the doors, passing information back in low voices. Renata had seen packed courtrooms before, had stood in some of the most closely watched civil rights cases in the state over the last decade. But there was something different about this one. Something in the particular silence of 300 people who had driven here, taken the day off their work, pulled their kids out of school because they needed to see this with their own eyes. Walter sat at the defense table in a dark suit and white shirt, hands folded in front of him, his face composed and still the way it always was, not cold, just settled, like a man who had already made peace with whatever was coming, and was simply waiting to find out what it was. Renata stood beside him and felt no such peace. She presented everything. The unedited video played 3 times on the courtroom screen, beginning to end, no cuts. The crack of the first slap, The second swing stopped cold, the 2 seconds, the crowd. Holt's face when he got up off the floor. She let it play without commentary, because it didn't need any. The four-star general's written statement was entered into the record. Judge Reeves read it in full from the bench, and the courtroom watched him read it. 4 pages, single-spaced, from a man who had commanded special operations forces across 3 decades, and chose to spend his measured, careful words on what kind of man Walter Greaves was, and what kind of career he had lived. And Reeves set the pages down. His expression gave nothing away. Doyle's affidavit, submitted 48 hours before her suspension made it impossible, was entered. 14 complaints, 4 years, every case number, every burial. Then the witnesses. Renee Holloway sat in the witness chair in a pressed blazer and told the courtroom exactly what happened. She was calm, clear, precise, and when the DA's attorney tried to suggest she'd been agitated and difficult to manage that day, she looked at him steadily and said, "I had a receipt." He showed it to him 4 times. You can see it in the video. She said it without anger, just as fact. The gallery was very quiet. Desmond testified. He was 71 and told the truth with the plain, unadorned directness of a man who had nothing to protect except his integrity, and had been protecting that, without difficulty, his entire life. Errol Banks sat in the front row in a button-down shirt he'd ironed himself, and testified about being called into the mall manager's office and fired for filming the truth. He said it exactly that way. Fired for filming the truth. Nobody in the room corrected his phrasing, because nobody could. Inada presented her closing argument, standing still, without notes. She was concise and devastating. When she finished, she sat down and put her hand over Walter's on the table. The gallery was silent. Judge Franklin Reeves looked at his notes for a long moment. He was 63, had sat on this bench for 12 years, and wore the careful, unrevealing face of a man who had built a career on not showing his hand. Inada watched him. She had done everything right. She knew she had done everything right. The video was irrefutable. The affidavit was documented. The pattern was clear. She had given this judge every tool he needed to do the right thing, wrapped and placed directly in front of him. He cleared his throat. He denied the motion. His stated reasoning was procedural. The matter was premature for dismissal and should proceed to trial, where all evidence could be properly weighed. Doyle's affidavit was ruled inadmissible on a technical filing ground Renata had never seen applied in this jurisdiction in 15 years of practice. Gallery erupted. Reeves's gavel came down hard, repeatedly. Renata sat very still. Outside on the courthouse steps, the gathered crowd fell completely silent when they saw her face emerge through the doors. 300 people reading one expression and understanding exactly what it meant. In the car, doors closed, the noise outside muffled to a low hum. Renata put her face in her hands. Walter put his hand on her shoulder. "I've been in worse places than this," he said quietly, "and I'm still here." She nodded. She didn't lift her face for a long time. Renata didn't sleep. She sat at Walter's kitchen table until 3 in the morning with the denied motion in front of her and a legal pad full of calculations that came out the same way, no matter how she ran them. Trial meant Judge Reeves. Reeves meant Garner's fingerprints on every ruling. Garner meant a DA who needed a conviction to keep his machine running. And a conviction meant her 68-year-old father, a man who had bled for this country in places it still wouldn't officially acknowledge, spending years inside a state correctional facility for defending himself after a cop hit him twice in a shopping mall. She ran the numbers again. They didn't change. She went to bed at 3:15. She heard Walter in his room, still, the steady breathing of a man who had learned to sleep through far more dangerous circumstances than this. Somehow that made it worse. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Garner sitting in his office right now, comfortable, certain, having watched his judge perform exactly as expected. She thought, not yet. She was back at the table by 6. At 6:47, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was unhurried, clear, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had long since stopped needing to announce it. "Is Greaves Iverson, my name is General Marcus Albright. I believe you've read my statement." She straightened in her chair. "General Albright." "Yes, sir." "Thank you for. I watched the ruling last night," he said. "I've also watched everything else that's happened to your father these past 3 weeks." A pause. "I'm coming to Caldwell. I'm bringing 3 men who served alongside Walter between 1988 and 2004. And I'm going to speak to the national press for the first time in 22 years. Renata was quiet a moment. "General, I want to make sure you understand what, Ms. Greaves Iverson." His voice was patient but immovable. "I commanded Special Operations Forces for 30 years. You understand the terrain." A shorter pause. "Nobody puts one of my soldiers in handcuffs for protecting a young woman from a bully with a badge and gets to call it justice. Not while I'm breathing." She exhaled slowly. "When can you be here?" 3 days, he said. "Make sure there are cameras." The second thing happened that same morning, 40 minutes later. Tyrell Banks called Renata's cell. She'd given him her card at the courthouse just in case, and his voice carried the tight energy of someone who'd discovered something and was moving fast before losing his nerve. He told her about the cloud backup. His phone had automatically saved the original uncompressed video to a cloud server the night he filmed it. Before his account got flagged, before the mall fired him, before anyone knew to look for it. Full resolution. Original timestamp. Every second intact. Renata gripped the phone tighter. Tyrell had already contacted Maya Sorrell, a national journalist who'd been covering the story for a major outlet since the video first broke. Maya had the file. She'd also been independently cross-referencing it with the mall's security footage, referenced in the original police incident report. She'd filed a records request for that footage. The mall denied it. She filed again, this time citing specific server infrastructure from the mall's own security contractor documentation, details she'd obtained through separate source reporting. The mall's legal team responded by confirming the footage existed, while arguing it was proprietary. Renata closed her eyes briefly. Amateurs. That confirmation was legally sufficient for Maya's network to pursue a court order compelling its release. The order was already in motion. "Tyrell," Renata said, "you did good." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, they fired me for filming the truth. Figured I should keep using it." The third thing didn't involve Renata at all. Carla Doyle drove to the city alone. She didn't call ahead. She parked in a public garage 2 blocks from the federal building, walked in through the main entrance, carrying a canvas bag with 2 flash drives and a printed index, and told the front desk she needed to speak with someone from the FBI Civil Rights Division. She sat across from a federal agent for 6 hours. She gave them everything, all 14 complaints, every piece of documentation tracking their burial, every communication where Garner had personally directed her to close a case. She answered every question completely, without hesitation, the way a person answers questions they've been waiting a long time to be asked. At the end of that week, the FBI had opened a formal civil rights investigation into the Caldwell County Police Department. Garner didn't know yet, but the ground beneath him had already started to shift. The court order came through on a Thursday morning. Maya Sorrell was in her rental car outside a Caldwell coffee shop when her network's legal team called to confirm it. She thanked them, ended the call, and sat quietly a moment with the phone in her lap. 12 years of investigative journalism had taught her to hold good news carefully, not let it outrun the facts. The order compelled release of the mall's full backup security footage. What that footage actually contained was, until she watched it, still an open question. She watched it 2 hours later in a conference room at her network's bureau, her producer beside her, a legal observer at the end of the table. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. Then Maya said, "Stop it there." The timestamp read 4:31 p.m., 16 minutes before Holt's encounter with Renee Holloway. The camera angle covered the service corridor running behind the clothing store, a wide shot, slightly elevated, clear and unobstructed. Derek Holt stood with a fellow officer near the corridor entrance, relaxed, laughing, the kind of easy, loose body language belonging to men who feel completely unobserved. Then Holt turned toward the clothing store entrance, visible at the edge of the frame, and drew his right hand back in a slow, theatrical arc, miming a slap. His mouth was moving. The fellow officer laughed harder. Holt did it twice. Then they straightened as a shopper passed nearby. E433, Holt had moved back into the main atrium. Maya watched it 3 more times. She watched the timestamp. She watched the body language. She watched the practiced ease of the gesture. Not the angry impulse of a man who'd later feel provoked, but the relaxed rehearsal of a man who'd already decided what he was going to do, and found it funny. He wasn't reacting to a threat. He was planning a performance. The broadcast aired that evening on the network's national platform. Idia presented the footage, without narration for the first 30 seconds, just the timestamp, the corridor, the gesture, the laughter. Then she spoke, precise and devastating, never editorializing beyond the facts, because the facts were already more than enough. Within 2 hours, the story had transformed. It had been a viral video about a remarkable old man was now documented evidence of premeditated civil rights abuse by a uniformed officer in a public space. National civil rights organizations issued formal statements before midnight, calling for immediate federal intervention. 4 attorneys contacted Renata's firm, offering to join the case pro bono. 2 former law enforcement officials appeared on national televisions, describing what they saw in the footage as grounds for immediate termination and federal prosecution. Renata watched the broadcast at Walter's kitchen table. Desmond sat across from her. Walter stood in the doorway to the hallway, arms folded, watching the screen without expression. It had ended. Desmond said, "Lord have mercy." Walter said nothing. He went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank it slowly at the counter. Renata called Maya directly. "The 4-minute mark," she said. "I need a certified copy of the full unedited file for the federal record." Ea said, "Already prepared. It'll be in your inbox by morning." Garner's office released a statement at 11 that night. 3 paragraphs describing the footage as taken out of context, emphasizing that Officer Holt had been responding to a developing situation in the store, and that the department stood fully behind its officers, pending the conclusion of all relevant investigations. Isia Sorrell addressed the statement on air the following morning. She pulled up the timestamp data, walked through the 16-minute gap between the corridor footage and Holt's approach to Renee Holloway, and noted precisely, without visible emotion, that a developing situation that hadn't yet developed couldn't reasonably be described as the context for a gesture made 16 minutes before any incident occurred. The statement disappeared from the Caldwell County PD website by noon. No replacement was issued. That evening, Renata arrived home to find Walter in the garden in the cold, as always. She stood at the back door and watched him a moment, moving between the beds, patient, unhurried, tending things that were already tended. She thought about Holt in that corridor, laughing. She thought about her father at the jewelry counter, deliberate, quiet, buying a necklace for his granddaughter. She went inside and added the certified footage file to the Federal Record Index. Then she called General Albright to confirm his arrival. He picked up on the first ring. The call came on a Friday morning. Renata was at the kitchen table, reviewing the Federal Record Index, when her phone buzzed. The number belonged to the DA's office, main line. She let it ring once before answering. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman who introduced herself as a member of D.A. Cobb's administrative staff, speaking in the careful, neutral tone of someone reading from a script they'd been given that morning and told to follow precisely. E.A. Cobb would like to schedule a call, the assistant said, to discuss a possible resolution to the Greaves matter, at the earliest convenience of Ms. Greaves Iverson. Renata set her pen down. "Put him on," she said. A brief pause. "Then, the DA is unavailable at this. Then, tell him I'm available at 9 Monday morning," Renata said. "And tell him to be ready to talk about a full dismissal, not a reduction." Not a quiet filing. A full public dismissal with a signed statement of no wrongdoing. These are my terms. He can think about them over the weekend. She ended the call and sat a moment with her hand resting on the phone. Outside, the December morning was gray and still. She could hear Walter moving in the back of the house, the quiet, methodical sounds of a man going about his morning. She picked up her phone and called Patrice. Cobb's office just reached out, she said. Patrice was quiet exactly 2 seconds. Then, he's looking for a way out. He's looking for a quiet way out, Renata said. He's not getting one. Cobb called personally at 8:57 Monday morning, 3 minutes early, which told Renata everything she needed to know about how his weekend had gone. He was smooth about it, she had to give him that. He used measured language, phrases like mutual resolution and the interests of the community, and acknowledging the complexity of the situation. He suggested a reduced charge, a public statement expressing regret for any distress caused, and a commitment to department review. Renata let him finish. Then she spoke. Mr. Cobb, she said, my client is a 68-year-old Medal of Honor recipient who was struck twice by a uniformed officer in a public mall while defending a young black woman who had a receipt in her hand. Your office charged him with felony assault and resisting detainment. You did this after receiving a video watched by 40 million people, a 4-year complaint file documenting a pattern of civil rights violations, and a written statement from a 4-star general. He paused. So here is what my client will accept. A full public dismissal of all charges with prejudice. A formal written statement of no wrongdoing, signed by you personally, read aloud at a press conference. Nothing less. Silence on the line. And if we proceed to trial, she continued, you will do so with General Marcus Albright and 3 decorated Special Operations veterans seated behind the defense table. You will do so with the FBI Civil Rights Division actively investigating your department's pattern of conduct. You will do so with Maya Sorrell in the front row and Lieutenant Doyle's 4-year complaint file entered into the federal record. And you will do so knowing that the security footage showing Officer Holt miming the slap 16 minutes before it happened has been certified preserved and is ready to play for any jury in this state. She stopped, let it sit. Russell Cobb breathed on the other end of the line. I'll need until tomorrow morning, he said. You have until 8 a.m., Renata said. Have a good day. She ended the call and sat very still a moment. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She found Walter in the garden, crouched near the rose bed with a hand trowel, doing something careful with the soil around the base of one of his late wife's plants. He said, Dad. He looked up. It's over, she said. Cobb's going to agree. He'll call tomorrow, but he's already decided. He paused. All charges. Full dismissal. Public statement. Walter looked at her a long moment. He set the trowel down. Danae Holloway, he said. Has she been told? I'll call her this afternoon. He nodded, picked up the trowel again, then said, What's the weather supposed to be like Thursday? Renata stared at him. Then she laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and tired and relieved. For the first time in 3 weeks. She went inside and called Desmond. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been sitting beside the phone the whole time. Thursday came cold and clear. By 9 in the morning, 300 people had gathered on the steps and sidewalk outside the Caldwell County Courthouse. They came in coats and scarves, breath visible in the December air. Some had driven hours. Some had been there since 8. A woman near the front held a hand-lettered sign that read simply, We saw the video. Nobody asked her to put it down. Hughes cameras lined the perimeter, 3 deep. Maya Sorrell stood near the front with her producer, notepad in hand, watching the courthouse doors. Renata arrived with Walter at 9:45. He wore his dark suit and white shirt, unhurried, moving through the crowd the way he moved everywhere, with a quiet, settled deliberateness that made people step back, not from intimidation, but from something more like instinct, the way a room goes still when something significant enters it. Desmond walked at his left, Renata at his right. General Marcus Albright was already on the steps in full dress uniform, ribbons and rings arranged across his chest in the precise formal language of a military career, spanning 30 years and 3 continents. He was 74 and stood like a man who had never once in his life slouched. 3 men flanked him, older, in civilian clothes, carrying the particular stillness of men who had operated in places that never made the news. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Renee Holloway stood in the front row in a gray coat, hands folded in front of her. She hadn't been asked to come. She'd come anyway. Terrell Banks stood 2 rows back, in the same button-down shirt he'd ironed for the hearing. He had nowhere else to be. Community college started in January. Russell Cobb appeared at 10 precisely through the courthouse doors. He was alone, no aide, no union representative, wearing the careful, compressed expression of a man who'd made a decision that was going to cost him politically, and had spent the last 3 days making peace with that. He approached the microphone stand set up on the landing, unfolded his statement. The crowd went completely silent, not the polite silence of ceremony, but the absolute silence of 300 people who had driven here, stood in the cold, and weren't going to miss a single word. Cobb read it straight through without looking up. All charges against Walter James Greaves were dismissed with prejudice, effective immediately. There was no legal basis for the charges as filed. The Caldwell District Attorney's Office formally acknowledged that Mr. Greaves's actions on the date in question were consistent with lawful self-defense and the defense of another civilian. The office expressed its sincere regret for the harm caused to Mr. Greaves, to his family, and to the community of Caldwell. He signed his name at the bottom, folded the paper, and stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted. The consequences came in the days that followed, in sequence, and none of them were quiet. Derek Holt was federally indicted on 3 counts of civil rights violations, built from the pattern documented across Doyle's 14 complaints. 6 of the 14 individuals watching the case finally move came forward with formal statements. Holt was suspended without pay. He issued no public statement. He never appeared in front of cameras. He had nothing left to perform for. Bill Garner resigned from the Caldwell County Police Department 4 days after the courthouse steps. He submitted the resignation in writing, without public comment, before the formal federal request for his termination could be issued. The city council accepted it in an emergency session held in a room that hadn't had an empty seat since the notice went out. He left the building through a side door. The machine he'd spent 20 years building had no ceremony left to offer him. Federal obstruction charges followed within the week. Judge Franklin Reeves received formal notification that a judicial conduct complaint filed by Renata and co-signed by 2 civil rights organizations had been accepted for review by the State Judicial Qualifications Commission. Terrell Banks's civil settlement with the mall included a formal written apology, full financial restitution for his wrongful termination, and a payment covering his first year of community college. He declined reinstatement. He enrolled in January. Renee Holloway filed a civil suit against the Caldwell County PD and the shopping center. With Renata's team and the weight of available evidence, it settled before it ever saw a courtroom. Carla Doyle was reinstated with full back pay by federal directive. 3 months later, she was promoted to captain, filling the vacancy left by the man who had buried 14 names in a drawer. Her first day in the office, she walked to that drawer, opened it, and closed it for the last time, empty, in front of her assembled team. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. 3 weeks after the courthouse steps, it was cold enough that you could see your breath inside the church hall if you stood near the doors. Someone had put white tablecloths on the folding tables. Someone else had arranged small flags at intervals along the center, evenly spaced, the way you space things when you want them to look like they were planned by someone who cared enough to measure. A woman from the church kitchen had made sweet potato pie and set it on a side table near the window, where the smell of it moved through the room like something warm and deliberate. About 40 people filled the space. Not a large crowd, not meant to be. General Marcus Albright had arranged it. He'd made 4 phone calls, and the thing had simply appeared. The way things appear when the person organizing them has spent a career making complicated things happen in difficult places with limited resources and no margin for error. 3 of the men who had come with him to the courthouse steps were here tonight, in dress uniforms that no longer quite fit the way they once had, broader in the middle now, narrower in the shoulders, the way time reshapes men who used to be built for specific and violent purposes. He stood together near the back wall with the easy, wordless comfort of people who had spent years trusting each other in the dark. Desmond sat in the second row with a handkerchief already in his hand, brought knowing he'd need it, unembarrassed about it. Renee Holloway sat in the third row in a dark green dress, uncertain at first whether she belonged here tonight. The Inada had called her personally and told her she did. Willow sat in the front row, 12 years old, wearing the necklace, the silver star on the thin chain, bought at a jewelry counter on a Tuesday in December by a grandfather who had stood at the glass case for 4 minutes debating whether she'd like it. He had loved it immediately. She had not taken it off. Walter wore the Medal of Honor. Renata had asked him the night before, standing in the kitchen while he joutted the dinner dishes, speaking to his back because she thought it might be easier that way. He'd been quiet a moment, then said, "All right, just that. All right." Like it was a small thing, like agreeing to bring an umbrella. He sat in the front row beside Willow and looked straight ahead while General Albright stood at the front of the room and spoke without notes. The way a man speaks, when the words have lived inside him a long time and no longer need to be written down. Albright talked about Mogadishu. He talked about October 4th, 1993, and what that day had cost, and what it had looked like from where he was standing, and what it had looked like according to the men who were there, from where Walter was standing. He talked about a soldier who saw civilians in a collapsing situation and moved toward them instead of away, who made a decision, not under order, not under instruction, purely from the unambiguous internal compass of a man who understood that some things were simply not negotiable, to put himself between those people and what was coming for them. He looked at Walter. "You have been doing this your entire life," he said. What happened in that mall was not an exception. He paused. It was a Tuesday. The room was very quiet. Walter stood when it was his turn. He thanked Renata first, said her name, looked at her, and didn't elaborate, because some things don't need elaboration. He looked at Desmond, already crying and not apologizing for it. Walter almost smiled. He looked at Renee Holloway in the third row and said her name clearly, so the whole room heard it. Then he said, "I was raised to believe that when you see something wrong, you have an obligation, not an option. An obligation." He paused. "That's not special operations training. That's my mother." Desmond laughed first, then the room laughed. Then Walter sat down, because he wasn't a man who lingered in the light longer than necessary. After the formal portion ended, Willow climbed into the chair beside him. She leaned against his arm the way she had since she was small. He put one hand over hers on the white tablecloth. Through the window behind them, the December garden was visible in the dark, his late wife's roses replanted, tended, still standing through the cold. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a grandfather at a party. He looked exactly like what he was. The story of Walter Greaves teaches a powerful lesson about courage, integrity, and the responsibility we all have to stand up against injustice. While the dramatic confrontation between an elderly man and a police officer captures attention, the deeper message is about doing what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous. If one of the most valuable lessons in this story is that silence can allow injustice to continue. When Renee Holloway was falsely accused and humiliated in public, most people chose to watch rather than get involved. Walter, however, refused to ignore what he knew was wrong. He understood that standing by and doing nothing would make him part of the problem. His actions remind us that every person has the power to make a difference when they choose courage over comfort. The story also highlights the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect. René was judged unfairly before anyone examined the facts. This serves as a reminder that prejudice and assumptions can lead to serious harm. We should always seek the truth before forming opinions about others, regardless of their appearance, background, or social status. Another powerful lesson is that true character is revealed during difficult moments. Walter did not help René because he wanted recognition or praise. In fact, he faced public humiliation, arrest, and the possibility of prison. He acted because his moral principles told him it was the right thing to do. His example shows that integrity means doing what is right even when there is a personal cost. The story further teaches that appearances can be deceiving. Many people saw Walter as an ordinary retired man, unaware of his extraordinary history of service and sacrifice. This reminds us never to underestimate others. Every person has a story, experiences, and strengths that may not be visible on the surface. Ultimately, Walter Greaves's story demonstrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. It encourages viewers to defend those who cannot defend themselves, to seek truth over convenience, and to remain faithful to their values in the face of adversity. The greatest heroes are often not those with power or fame, but those who choose to stand up for what is right, when everyone else remains silent.